Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us on this Google Hangout. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm a Vice President at the Atlantic Council and Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. We apologize for the delay, but that was due to a lack of a link between Washington and Silicon Valley. Now, the conversation this morning will touch upon Secretary Carter's initiative to bring innovation from Silicon Valley to the Pentagon. We've assembled some really fantastic speakers, most of whom are fellows and Atlantic Council staff, including in the Brent Scowcroft Center. So here in the Scowcroft Center, we spend quite a bit of time looking at emerging technologies, innovation, global trends, and their effects in particular on strategy at the national security level and also at the defense level, and have discussed these issues in quite a bit of detail with senior DOD and NSC officials, and we're really thrilled to have just a top-notch staff and network, including our ability to have someone like Michael Horowitz speak as part of our programming, I think, which shows our commitment to these issues. For a very long time, we've advocated a much stronger link between Silicon Valley and Washington. Most prominently, we had former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley on our stage last year on a conference on disruption and defense, and Steve said it would really behoove Washington to bring the Silicon Valley ethos to our defense and national security apparatus. We have a strategic foresight initiative practice area here that looks at global trends and their impacts on America's role in the world. We have an Emerging Defense Challenges initiative run by Steve Grundman, who will speak on this during this hangout, and that practice area looks at creative ways to solve problems at the intersection of defense ministries and industry. We also constantly travel to Silicon Valley with our partners to talk about these issues and their intersection with some of the leading technologists there in the Valley. So when Secretary Carter gave his speech on April 23rd, it really played to a set of conversations we've been convening for quite a while. A few questions that I'll briefly explore, then I'll introduce our speakers, and then we'll go right to the discussion. First, I think the key question is there's a lot of skepticism in the Valley about this initiative. You can't just announce it and expect it to happen. And so how are we going to get companies that are interested in customers that are much easier to deal with and potentially have a lot more financial wherewithal than DOD? How can we try to overcome those obstacles? How can we make this a meaningful effort, in particular in light of budget austerity? Does the push to engage Silicon Valley day to day, is it doable? How can the Pentagon incentivize companies in the Valley? In what ways does this mesh with the broader offset strategy, and can this be a fruitful partnership for all parties involved? So we'll be looking at these and related questions. This session is on the record. It will be live tweeted at AC Scowcroft from the hashtag AC Defense, Atlantic Council Defense, AC Defense. We hope that you can join us in this conversation, and if you have a question, please tweet it at AC Scowcroft while using the hashtag. Let me briefly introduce our discussants. First, Pat O'Reilly is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Brent Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council. He retired as a lieutenant general in the Army after a very distinguished career, culminating in his leadership as director of the Pentagon's Missile Defense Agency, and he was the technical architect for the United States' current missile defense approach. He currently is the senior vice president of Alphabet Energy out there on the West Coast, where his company looks at thermoelectric technologies. Michael Horowitz is an associate professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania in my hometown. He's the author of an award-winning book, The Diffusion of Military Power, Causes and Consequences for International Politics, and his expertise is on military innovation, the future of war, and forecasting, and we're really thrilled that he's joining us today. Kate Brannon is a non-resident senior fellow also here at the Brent Scowcroft Center. She was previously senior reporter with Foreign Policy covering the Pentagon. Many of you have no doubt heard her name, and this is also her first council event as a speaker, and we're just thrilled to be engaging with someone as talented as Kate. And then Steve Grundman is the MA and George Lund Fellow here also at the Scowcroft Center. He was the Vice President of Charles River Associates, where he was the Director of Aerospace and Defense Consulting. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Pat O'Reilly for his initial remarks. Pat, please kick us off, if you will.
Thank you, Barry. My perspective on this issue is at the transactional level. It's based on my 25 years in DOD acquisition business, and for the last several years, advising startups, and now I'm a member, as you said, of Alphabet Energy, a Silicon Valley startup, bringing to market semiconductor technology that converts waste heat to electricity. And I have seen clearly that there are strong similarities and distinct differences between the Pentagon and Silicon Valley communities. They both have hardworking professionals that face the same challenge to synchronize resources, technology awareness and risk insights, and the need to rapidly produce a product to market fit if you're a startup, or you're focused on technology to battlefield fit if you're the Pentagon. However, the Silicon Valley companies try to get an edge on competition, while the Pentagon tries to enforce competition. And these different paradigms result in two clearly distinctive behaviors in technical discourse and the speed of actions. In the Silicon Valley, intense, interactive technical discourse usually precedes and shapes business and contractual actions to rapidly transition technologies to the market. In contrast, the Pentagon processes, driven by federal acquisition regulations and congressional language, delays intensely interactive technical discourse until after a competitive source selection process and contract negotiations occur, when the companies can only then share their ideas with the government subject matter experts without fear of compromising competitiveness. Currently allowed pre-source selection correspondence with DOD contracting officials is not the same as interactive discourse with subject matter experts, where the essence of technical needs and solutions can be formulated. To illustrate the difference in the speed of actions between the two communities, I offer you to look at the DOD Rapid Innovation Fund. It's a very good idea. It was created by Congress in 2011 to quickly transition promising technologies to the military. However, as you can see on their website, the submission date for this year's new technologies is June 15, 2015. But the contract awards do not occur until June 16. Not very rapid by Silicon Valley standards or anywhere. So these are just two practical examples of the difficulties encountered by trying to have the two communities work engaged and more interactively. So in summary, significant regulatory reforms must occur to enable the military's rapid adoption of new technologies, and it should be driven by technical achievement, such as in the Silicon Valley, rather than congressional budget timelines. In other words, DOD's outreach to the Silicon Valley must be accompanied by congressional outreach to the Silicon Valley to accomplish the vision that Secretary Carter has clearly articulated. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Pat, let me ask you a couple of questions just really quickly, and then we'll move to Michael Horowitz. But I mean, your point about the DOD's Rapid Innovation Fund and not being really rapid is sounds quite familiar to we Washington hands, but yes, I mean, can DOD move more quickly than 1 year to contract award?
I think they can. One obvious approach is to take, instead of annual submissions of ideas, theoretically you take the work and break it into quarters. So there's quarterly submission of ideas, And that's just a very simple way to do it. There probably would be additional administrative inefficiencies of doing it that way, but if you look at what you're trying to achieve, which is speed and being exposed to good ideas as they're emerging, small companies can't wait a year for these type of decisions. Our pace is at a much, much faster, much more rapid tempo. And so and I only use that one as the example. I would say if you look at most of these initiatives where you apply good technical ideas or for review, they're on, at best, a semi-annual approach. So that's just one simple step, is to break it more quickly. Another is to create, there are success stories. And we are currently in dialogue with the Army Research Lab, for example, of creating a cooperative research and development agreement where it's almost continuous interaction. Those are more of the examples I think could be pursued by the department in a much greater, to a much greater extent, to which would move you forward in the right direction, I believe.
So is this what you meant then, Pat, also by more congressional outreach in addition to DOD outreach to the Valley? In other words, exposing congressional members as well as key staff to the need for a very different approach, a much more rapid and nimble and agile approach that doesn't take the normal DOD timelines of a year or more likely multiple years?
Yes, I truly do. One thing is to look at the technologies more iteratively from a congressional point of view. So, again, instead of awarding very long contracts, you especially in the Permian, they could still parse it out where there's a balance between accountability and auditability, at the same time getting the resources and the exposure to the technologies on a much quicker basis. So exactly right. I do believe the staffs and members would benefit from a review from a point of view of not just accountability and competitiveness, but also speed of transactions.
Great. Thanks, Pat, very much. I think we're starting to get into some of the specifics, which is really what I want to do in this conversation. Let me turn now to Michael Horowitz to hear his initial thoughts on these issues. Michael?
Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me today. I mean, my perspective here is based on my research on military innovation, which focuses on how countries, how military specifically, try to get ahead and stay ahead. And the thing that I would start with in this regard is that it's hard to innovate when you're number one. If you look in the mirror every day and you say that you're the best, like, hey, I'm really good looking, then it's difficult to innovate. And I think that that's something that has been challenging for the Defense Department over the last generation in some ways, and it's becoming especially important today. And in particular, I would differentiate between innovating when it comes to buying new widgets, technical change, and innovating when it comes to changing organizational processes, how it is that we think about how to use technologies. Because those are different things, and I think to some extent, when we talk about Silicon Valley and the DoD's interaction with Silicon Valley, these things end up getting conflated. In that we know that the Pentagon's weapons acquisition process is too slow. I mean, we've heard it already today. I'll say it. I suspect others will say it as well. Our weapons acquisition process is too slow, and it is not nimble. And one of the single biggest problems with it is the failure to experiment. And that when so much money is relegated to just the big buy, to the the decision to purchase the say the F-35 or the F-22 or some other big capital-intensive platform, then there's so much less money available for experimentation. It means you're too quickly, and we know this from the history of military innovation, you're too quickly necking down and picking winners, which discourages overall innovation, and that's the opposite of the way that something like Silicon Valley works. And the thing about this that I think is really challenging today, and why the outreach by Secretary Carter and others in the Pentagon is so important, is that there are reasons to think that the means of production of military power are changing in some ways. And that if you think, way back to say when, why do you not have mercenary armies with all of the most advanced military technologies in the world? Well, one reason is that building advanced military equipment is really expensive and really complicated and requires the sort of organizational, military-focused investments that essentially only nation states can do. Will that still be true in a world of cyber, in a world of 3D printing, in a world of military robotics, where the underlying technologies are very much commercially oriented rather than necessarily militarily oriented? It's very different from something like, say, stealth technology, which is an inherently military, more or less technology. And I think what that does is it not only, that shift in the means of defense production is not only disruptive, for the world, it's also fundamentally challenging for how the United States has thought about weapons acquisition. And it's why I think that the important, one of the most important things with Silicon Valley outreach, it's not just getting the new widgets and getting the ideas, it's also trying to whatever extent possible, to build more of a culture of experimentation within the Pentagon. The thing that's encouraging to me is that it seems like the Pentagon's senior leadership is committed to this. I think they really are. I think the challenge is that there are organizational and bureaucratic antibodies within the Pentagon that make, the same reason, Rapid Reaction Fund, not that rapid. The same, all of those same things make this type of rapid sort of thinking more difficult. And so I guess I would conclude by saying I think it's important that we separate the challenge of the design challenge of how do we get new ideas for the next technology from how do we get ideas for how to build that technology and then how to integrate that technology into the force. Because I think that innovation is required across all of these areas, and that Silicon Valley has some things it has to, to offer across all of these areas, and that we need to be careful that outreach doesn't just end up in one or the other bucket, but instead crosses that spectrum.
Wow, Michael, thanks very much. You raised a number of questions, and I see we're already getting some questions on Twitter, which we'll get to. I mean, I think you're one of your key points, and you make quite a few, I think, that's worth just hearing a little bit more on is how Ash Carter is the right Secretary of Defense to start this process, to oversee this process. He was in Silicon Valley when the president called him back. But I worry. I mean, if Ash Carter is the only, one really pushing this with the necessary vigor, the necessary management attention, the necessary innovation and understanding, how far is it going to go in his spare time? And this is a typical Washington question, but shouldn't he appoint a czar or someone who's got the same mindset, attributes, and understanding and orientation to push this through?
No czars, no czars. I think he in some ways already has his czar, and that's Bob Work. I can think of no deputy
another official who doesn't have a lot of time to do this.
No,
he's got a very large portfolio.
No, that's fair, but I think that it's not necessarily about having one person with the innovation portfolio. Although, I mean, certainly if you can find one, that would be, in some ways that could be terrific, although you certainly just risk replicating another bureaucracy. I think it's more about changing the institutional incentives within the services. As much as we like to think that it's OSD driving the boat, it's the services and a lot of those micro-level procurement decisions that are often important. And I think it's about changing those service-level incentive structures. It's one of the reasons why I think the Navy, for example, creating an uninhabited systems office and potential deputy assistant secretary is potentially an early good sign that some of these ideas from very busy people are starting or filtering down in a way that could encourage change at the service level.
Boy, I couldn't agree with you more, Michael. I was in the Pentagon when transformation was the buzzword, and new civilians came into leadership positions and said, we're going to transform the way we do business and the way we deploy military capabilities. And I watched very closely as all of the services quickly repackaged their current budgets and their current programs and activities as 100% transformational. Everything they were doing up to that point was transformational, and they didn't need to make a single change in what they were planning on doing in order to be transformational. So I think, as you said, changing the service level incentives and creating people with the right perspectives, in those bureaucracies is really important to ensure that there are sufficient champions in the organization for this kind of initiative. And the reason I'm spending a lot of time on organizational process and a czar, I mean, the Pentagon's processes have been one of its main obstacles to innovation. It's the people in the field that have innovated, especially in wartime, rather easily, and it's the process that bogs things down, that takes too long, as Pat said. And so I think it's a really important point that we just don't come up with principles that we think make sense in the real world, but then don't work in the very, very detailed, complicated context of the Pentagon bureaucracy. So with that, let me turn to now Kate Brannon and hear her thoughts on this wide set of issues. Kate?
Hi. Thank you so much for having me as part of this conversation. My perspective is as a journalist, and from my reporting and conversations with people inside the Pentagon and in the Valley and a few people in the defense industry. So I am looking at notes as I speak too, so excuse me. But I started thinking about this in February as Secretary Carter was going through his confirmation process. I was looking to write a story about what he might prioritize as secretary, and his financial disclosure form sort of provided the clue for me that during his 1 year away from the Pentagon, in between being the Deputy Defense Secretary and now the Secretary, he really sort of made some quick inroads into the Valley, teaching at Stanford and serving as an advisor on a handful of high-tech companies. So that paired with his time, his earlier job at the Pentagon as the Pentagon Acquisition Chief, where he's made it very clear that he learned sort of the messy, ugly world of defense acquisition. I thought that this was definitely going to be something that he'd try to tackle while in office. So his April speech didn't come as too much of a surprise, I think, to people in the building and to people out in the Valley. They sort of were looking for him to do this. But as folks have already said, that the big question is there's this huge difference between saying something and doing it and getting it done. And the getting it done, I think people have a lot of questions about whether the Pentagon will be pushed to change. So first, just to talk a little bit about how the Pentagon has received Carter's initiatives. Folks I talked to said that there's a lot of enthusiasm and that people really agree with what he said. But again, that there's this doubt about whether the Pentagon bureaucracy can change. And this one official who's really supportive of it said he's really worried that there's this tendency that when a secretary asks for something to be done and there's not a lot of time to do it, you grab whatever you're already doing that kind of looks like it, and in this case is probably inadequate, and then recast it as the thing that he's asking for. And there's a lot of fear that this might happen, with this Valley outreach. And then I've heard that there's some resistance inside the Pentagon in the acquisition office from folks who are wary and skeptical of sort of new ways of doing business, and the traditional Pentagon way of issuing an RFI. Pat talked about how long it can take to get to contract, but that's the way people are used to doing business, and so any sort of push to change that can ruffle some feathers. Part of Secretary Carter's announcement in April was the creation of what is being called the Defense Innovation Unit X, or already it's got its acronym DIUX. It's going to be staffed with military and civilian active duty and reserve military, and then some civilian officials as well. And it's supposed to be sort of the Pentagon's first permanent representation out in the Valley. You know, set up an office. It's supposed to scout new technology and sort of be a go-between the technology companies out there and the Pentagon back in D.C. And you know, this idea is supported, but there's a lot of questions about it, both in the Valley and at the Pentagon. And a big one is, how is the Pentagon going to make use of what these guys out in the Valley are finding? You know, is it going to go into a static database? And how will their discoveries be linked to actual problem sets that combatant commanders in the field have? And that's a big concern. I heard from a few people that in the Valley, problems drive technology, and if an actual problem isn't linked to the technology answer, then the whole thing is sort of useless. You know, just looking for technology's sake isn't going to open any doors, one person told me. And in the Valley, money doesn't always open doors either. You really have to have a good problem and an ability to translate it to the right people. And I think that that's one of the big challenges for DOD out there. Let's see. Another portion of what Carter announced was that they're going to make some investments in In-Q-Tel, a nonprofit that was started by the intelligence community out there, and that DOD has done some business with, but not a ton. And folks said to me that this is this was sort of a signal by Carter saying, we're going to try to do business with you on your terms, but that's a promise that's going to be pretty difficult for him to keep. Sort of the In-Q-Tel model is, if you invest $10 million in In-Q-Tel, they're going to make 10 $1 million investments, out of which maybe one will pay off, and that would be, you know, great results. But those aren't really odds that the Pentagon's used to working with, and they're definitely not odds that Capitol Hill will be crazy about. And so, as you know, Barry, you've already said, and Pat said, it's really important to get buy-in from Capitol Hill on this. Otherwise, you know, DOD could, you know, once again be beat up for wasting taxpayer dollars. But really, the appetite for risk when it comes to working with, you know, high-tech startups has to change, because that's just not the way they work, and you know, you have to create incentives for them to come do business with DOD. Excuse me. And then I'll just skip to a little bit of what I heard from some Silicon Valley folks. Let's see. So again, there's enthusiasm and this sense that this is long overdue, so of course it's a good thing that Carter has announced this. And one person said to me, you know, it's amazing. He looks around, you know, outside his office, and he sees representatives from, you know, at least 100 international companies, you know, with permanent offices in the Valley, and that it's just incredible that this government outreach out there from the Pentagon, and now DHS is going to be doing it as well. But lots of pessimism too, that Carter's initiatives will either be watered down or implemented counter to how the Valley operates. I think that that's a big thing that sort of hits on this culture clash between Washington and the Valley. And let's see, again, you know, more about how you have to have the linkage between problem sets and technology, and that another point on this DUIX office is that it can't be the single point of contact between the Valley and the Pentagon, because then it really becomes just a choke point, and it really has to be, the folks out there have to be sort of the go-between and the translators between Washington and Silicon Valley technology companies. And by no means should it mean that other people from the Pentagon don't travel to Silicon Valley. You know, it shouldn't be thought of as, we've got this DIUX office out there, so now we don't have to go. That would be, you know, a disaster. That the DIUX office should sort of be scouting and finding the right people for when, you know, the combatant commander or whoever it is, the DOD civilian official, goes to the Valley, that he can be put in touch with the right people to talk about the right problems. That is it. I'll leave it there. Sorry if I was a little scattershot, but there you go.
No, not at all. I don't think you were scattershot at all, Kate. And I would.
Is it frozen or is it just me?
I was just about to ask the same thing.
So Barry, we can't hear you.
Barry, your site is frozen. There you go.
Can you hear now?
Yep.
Great. Kate, I just was asking sort of how would you suggest going about sort of changing the culture in the Pentagon? That's a big question. Changing the service level incentives, other than just creating an office. You know, are there any specific things? You've been in these offices, you've been in the halls there, you understand the way it works. Do you have any thoughts in particular also on how to make this real instead of just an announcement?
Well, one person said they were happy to see that the right people were being picked to go staff this DIUX, that it wasn't just sort of a random collection, but you know they were picking the right people. So I think that that's a big piece of it. I also think, you know, folks I heard from that are working this problem sort of before Carter announced it are working in somewhat obscurity. So I think as secretary, it's difficult to know all that's going on inside the building. So making sure you're aware of the folks you already have who are already doing, you know, good work and that are thinking about this, making sure they're on your radar. And I think, you know, having a really complete assessment of who you've already got and where you already stand, which I don't think that he has yet. Because, you know, I've heard from folks who I know are working this but don't feel like they're on his radar yet. And then to go to sort of what Pat was talking about, the RFI process, one source sort of shared with me a recent RFI that the Army put out that was a really vague problem set, and then if you were picked by the Army, you'd be invited to an industry day at Fort Huachuca where you could there was no money involved, and you might be invited to go to Fort Huachuca, which that's not going to entice anybody in the Valley to go do or to participate in. So rethinking, I think that process is a really big part of it.
Great, and no doubt much more would be needed, but thank you. Now I'd love to hear from Steve Grundman, live from Ontario, on these issues, in particular from his perspective at the intersection between defense industry and defense ministries and departments. Steve?
Okay, thank you, Barry. Thanks very much. A couple things to get started. One is a sound check. I assume you can hear me? I assume you can hear me, yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes.
So one of the observations I would make is I think what Secretary Carter was doing was more an exercise in leadership than in management. And I think a lot of the reactions, I dare say even this conversation, have kind of leaped to the how's this going to work level. And I think his objectives for it were more to the end of calling out broader themes. You know, what's important, and who are the audiences that I want engaged in this thing that I think is important. Which isn't to say that ultimately, for some fruit to come of it, the sorts of problems and conundra that we have focused on heretofore in this conversation won't need to get resolved. They will, but I think that is too high an expectation to set for a tone-setting trip of a couple days. And I think that tone is set in a couple of ways. One is, this is very early in the new Secretary's tenure as Secretary of Defense, and he took 2 days, right? He took 2 days. Any of you who've been around the Pentagon or around Secretary of Defense would know that a secretary who takes 2 days within the first 6 or 7 weeks of his tenure in office during congressional markup season, among other things, is a big deal. You know, signals to at least one of the audiences how important he thinks this is. And so let me speak to that. I think there were 3 different audiences for this exercise in leadership, and one of them certainly was Silicon Valley, but another was the building, if you will, the inside audience, and then a third indeed was defense industry. And let me pick off each one of those and suggest what I think was the message that he was trying to send to each of them. To Silicon Valley, I think the primary message was one of trying to create a level of trust with a community which, it must be said, since before the Snowden leaks, but even after the Snowden leaks, had viewed the U.S. government in general, and maybe the Pentagon in particular, as antagonistic. So one of the things we haven't mentioned, but which was announced concurrent with his trip out to Silicon Valley, was the new cyber strategy. And I think the Secretary realizes that unless, as much as said, unless the private sector expertise that largely owns and operates the infrastructure of cyberspace can work in cooperation with the Department of Defense on a basis of trust, that the U.S. is going to have perforations in its cyber defenses. So I think, although we haven't yet spoken about that, and I don't know that cyber strategy is really the focus of this conversation, nevertheless, I think it was indicative of what I think the primary message that he was trying to convey to the Silicon Valley audience, which is, let's get back together. Let's get back together into a relationship of trust and collaboration and cooperation. You know, it's worth mentioning that the impetus, at least one of them, for him going out there was to receive and deliver the Sidney Drell Lecture at Stanford University. And as part of his address, he talked about how he got in the business of national security. As most people know, Ash Carter's a physicist. And the way he got involved in national security was this other physicist, this eminent physicist, Sidney Drell, pulled him aside at some point during a fellowship out there and said, you should direct your interests and research and effort into the national security realm. And a lot of, I know Ash is intimate with this really strong tradition, which maybe was greatest in the 60s and 70s, of a very active and natural collaboration between the defense establishment, the technology establishment, if you will, which not as exclusively then was it located in Silicon Valley, but an important part of it still, even back then, was in that community. So anyway, he was trying to create a relationship of trust with Silicon Valley. I think that was the main message for that audience. For the internal audience, he was trying to do what a leader has to do, which is, if they're on their mark, is tell people what's important, tell people what they care about, and orient their thinking. Now, there's a long distance between simply telling the Acquisition Management Corps, I think it's important that we engage Silicon Valley, and getting productive product and technology out of it, but it is the important first step, and there's nobody like the Secretary of Defense by his own actions, not a memo, not even a speech from the podium of the Pentagon, but you know, physically going out to Silicon Valley for a couple of days to convey to the internal workforce and the acquisition management system what he thinks is important. And I again, any of you who've worked in the Pentagon know people follow what the leadership is doing and try to get in step with it generally. There are recalcitrants, and there's a great dynamic of these things, of course, that is fun for reporters and even those of us who have been in the building to participate in, but it makes a big difference to know and to orient to what the Secretary thinks is important, and he was doing that. Finally, for the defense industry audience, I think he was endorsing what I would call, and Michael's comments spoke to this to some degree, not so much technologies, but a style of technology and product development, which this industry, you know, indeed in collaboration with the Pentagon itself, has sort of lost. And it's a style that I thought was cleverly expressed by David Brin, of all people, the science fiction writer, who was at the council last year for an event, and he juxtaposed what he called the Route 128 culture of product development. Route 128, of course, being the beltway, if you will, around Boston, and which I think it might be fair to say, at least over the last 20, 30 years, has been some kind of a hub of defense innovation. It's where, for example, the Lincoln Labs and MIT's Lincoln Labs, among other such institutions exist. He was juxtaposing what he called the Route 128 culture to the Sand Hill Road culture. And he talked about how the way product development is done in Silicon Valley, and I don't think he was maybe overstating slightly for effect, but he was saying 5 guys get together, put something together in a weekend and give it to people, give it to customers, put it in their hands, let them play with it for a week, talk to them on Friday, and then over the next weekend they'll try another iteration of it. And this is something which is anathema to the Route 128 culture. We don't put stuff in customers' hands until it's damn near perfect. That's only one instance of the difference in these styles. But I think it's I think calling out and endorsing a style of product and technology development that is exemplary and exemplified by what we call Silicon Valley, I think was an important message for the defense industry. It's worth observing that although the things were not coordinated, that in the same week that the Secretary made this trip out to Silicon Valley, Raytheon made arguably the most important major acquisition in the post-Iraq War era thus far, and that is a over $1 billion acquisition of a commercial cybersecurity company called WebSense. The conjunction of those two events, which again I think was not coordinated, nevertheless resonates together, and positively so, to the ends of what I think Secretary Carter was trying to call out to industry as important for them to consider. Again, there's a long distance of work and problems that would need to be overcome to really take full advantage of the opportunity between the Route 128 culture, the Pentagon, and Silicon Valley, the Sand Hill Road culture, to get together and produce things that are going to improve our national security. But getting the Secretary of all Defense to stand up and say, this is important, I want you paying attention to it, I think was the necessary first step.
Great, thanks, Steve. Just a couple follow-up questions that I really liked your 3 audiences, and would just ask you in particular about that. I mean, is it possible, there are messages to each of the 3 audiences, but I think the key here is how do we get audience 1, the Valley, to engage productively, and how do we get with the other 2, and how do we get the other 2, which is probably the biggest obstacle, to harness the creativity and technology coming out of Silicon Valley to do, as Kate Brannon said, to meet the combatant commander's needs, not just now, but in 2020 and 2030. I mean, how do we get these 3 audiences together? Are there other things that should be considered? It sounds like you think this is a great start, and I agree with that. But I'm curious as to what do you think is the best way to go forward doing this?
There's no one answer to that. I'll offer a couple, 3 things. One of which is that one of which I suppose is indicated by the In-Q-Tel and the DIUX. I'm glad we don't call that DUIX. That would be a whole other thing. And that is that what really engages entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley is not, and this quote I'll regret, revenue, but capital. And so I think one of the things the Pentagon's going to have to do, and again, it's what In-Q-Tel and government enterprises like it, of which there are a couple others, perhaps DIUX is going to be one of them. What they do is they make investments in companies. They put risk capital into companies that are working, either are working on problems that the Pentagon is interested in, or could be working on problems. But the way to attract their attention is not by paying them things to deliver either engineering hours or products, but by giving them capital with which to grow their companies. And that really is the lifeblood of Silicon Valley, and I think one of the things the Pentagon's going to have to do in order to engage that spirit out in Silicon Valley is to get involved in being an investor more than a customer. Now that runs directly across a very strong tradition in America called "we don't do industrial policy," but I think as a country we're either going to have to just call it something else, or we're going to have to get over that. That we don't do industrial policy, which is not true to begin with. We just like telling ourselves it's true. Maybe I'll leave. You know, there could be other things that would need to be done. You know, again, I would cite the acquisition of WebSense by Raytheon as the kind of thing which industry could do to better engage this Sandhill Road style of acquisition. Certainly, WebSense has a great and growing business that Raytheon, in a segment of the market Raytheon wants to address. But by the same token, I have little doubt but that Tom Kennedy, the CEO of Raytheon, wants to infiltrate some of that style of WebSense back into the cybersecurity businesses that Raytheon sells to the U.S. government as well.
Thanks, Steve. And I might then pose a similar question to the rest of our panelists. I mean, Steve, I think, rightly pointed out that this was meant to deliver messages, not so much to you know, to plot in detail the way forward on this. But I am sensitive, and we all have to be sensitive. There's 18 months left in administration, and things tend to slow down about a year from now, if not sooner. I mean, things in many ways stop in Washington during an election year in terms of policy and reforms. And so a lot less than 18 months to go. So even if we all agree this is a great start, would love to hear the panelists' views on, is there enough time for this, for all of the things that all of you talked about? Can Secretary Carter make this happen, even with all of the great people around him, even doing the things that all of you talked about? I mean, we really have a 12-month window. Let's be a little clearer. Some of us have been in the bureaucracy in the last summer of an administration, and nothing happens. So what do people think are the priorities, and how will Carter deal with this ticking clock where there's very few days left to get anything done in a major way? What do you think the keys are to doing this right?
All right, I'll jump in. Sorry to keep going, but hearing nothing else, I'll jump in. You know, in answering that question, I would hearken to one of the things he did when he was the Undersecretary of Defense and rolled out better buying power, which was approaching the end of the first term. Right? There was no. He had in I guess the end of 2010, beginning of 2011. He wasn't quite as near to the end of that term as they are now, but he was pretty close. And I think one of the tactics that he used there was to focus the initiatives on a couple of big objects to try to, I guess not in his words, but in mine, capture a couple of early wins in respect to the initiatives that were being rolled out with respect to Better Buying Power 2.0. And so my guess is that he, again, through Bob Work and Frank Kendall and the assistant service acquisition executives, will look for some kind of early wins here. I'm not sure whether early wins, you know, what exactly would constitute an early win in this context. One thing I suppose might be a signature acquisition strategy. I'm not familiar enough with the range of acquisition plans coming down the pike to know one, but I can imagine them looking for a program coming, you know, approaching milestone 2 perhaps, or even milestone 3, and standing up the acquisition strategy in a way that either specifically reached out to commercial firms or motivated, incentivized the traditional defense contractors to engage with commercial firms to address the opportunity. Would be so, or you know, look for a couple of pre-made, if you will, or deliberate early objects to demonstrate what he has in mind here and the merit in it.
Mike here. I would just jump in to say that I think one of the accomplishing all of what we've laid out in the last 18 months of an administration isn't realistic. I mean, we all know that. What I think the encouraging thing is that I think the community of people who are really engaged on this issue inside and outside the Beltway, or that it's a bipartisan group, and that while it happens to be Deputy Secretary Work and Secretary Carter that are in Undersecretary Kendall that are in the leadership role right now, I think that there are strong leaders across the aisle. I mean, if you look at some of the people who are the most engaged in Congress on this issue, there were certainly Republicans on that list. And I think that if this effort is going to succeed, it's going to have to be a bipartisan effort. And I think one of the things that's encouraging about this, again, is that whether or not all of this works is a different story, but the community of people that are interested, crosses the aisle, and I think that's a good thing.
No, I think that's right. Let me add a point. Let me add a finer point to it, and ask Pat O'Reilly and Kate Brannon with this added sense of urgency that I will add. I mean, Michael's initial comments talked about basically the world that we describe here at the Atlantic Council as a world of individual empowerment, where a lot of technologies that have very significant military applicability are being democratized. In other words, people can build it themselves, people can put things together, people can program soon, if not now, swarms of drones to do different things. We saw a demonstration of that at the Atlantic Council a few weeks ago. And so this is a world where DOD could get surprised very quickly, and certainly within the next 18 months, in a militarily significant way. It's a world we also described in our recent strategy paper that we call dynamic stability. But Kate and Pat in particular would love to hear your thoughts on, with this clock ticking before the administration leaves or can no longer get something done politically, and with the potential for a new type of strategic shock in the form of groups and individuals using technologies, and few people know more about this dynamic than Pat O'Reilly. How can Carter move this more quickly to be able to help continue to defend the country in a world of very unpredictable threats coming around?
Well, Barry, I share your concern with the individual empowerment, like we said, and it goes on and on and on, all the very disconcerting scenarios that could literally suddenly threaten us around the world and our allies and our friends. So to specifically answer your question, I think that realistically what Secretary Carter could do and the Pentagon could do is, as Steve and others have said, is raise the imperative of this issue. What's the priority of it in discourse in Congress? I also believe strongly that the amount of change that really needs to occur, and again, my point is Secretary Carter needs to emphasize, or I think he has a pulpit in which to emphasize the need, the imperative that this change occur as soon as it practically can. And from that I mean, with all my experience with the bureaucracy and so forth, in a pragmatic way, is raise this debate with Congress and use his position. And as I think that's an excellent idea of establishing some example acquisition strategies. That is something that could be done within 6 months and use them to inculcate the culture. So Congress is going to have to do the heavy lifting, to be honest. But there are things the Pentagon can do, especially in the next 18 months, to raise the need for this to occur, and especially in a bipartisan way. I would also like to jump back to that. I think the point of this would be to, again, increase allow intensive technical discourse between subject matter experts and the technologists in Silicon Valley and in Boston and other regions. Silicon Valley I see as a metaphor more than anything else. I mean, because that does not occur. People assume it occurs. It really is a guarded conversation between technologists and the commercial side and the DOD bureaucracy. I personally signed more non-disclosure statements in a month working in Silicon Valley than I did in a year, anytime in my career, past 25 years working in the acquisition business. It's they tend to have large open conversations with, again, with this focus on competition, or if you're really going to get to these groundbreaking insights, I believe those are more one-on-one conversations where there is a trust, and one mechanism for a trust is signing non-disclosure statements that says that what the company is revealing is not going to be carried any further than that conversation. Those are the type of mechanisms that need to be put into place, I believe, and Secretary Carter does have time to show examples and lead the conversation.
Thanks, Pat.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kate, please.
Well, I was just going to say with this DIUX office, I think there is enough time to get that up and running, and the key is to get it running in a way that Silicon Valley folks buy into it and see that it's value added for them. And I think that's the tricky thing to accomplish over the next 18 months. The next administration, I think, will be loath to shut it down or whatever. And while it's small, it's still a lot better than what we have today. So that would be a small success that I think he could push through. And then back to what you were saying about, should there be a czar or, who's in charge of this? And I don't know if there needs to be a czar, but clearly somebody who has the time to devote, somebody high level who has the time to actually focus on this needs to be, identified and empowered to, spend all their time on this. And I've been told that Tom Earhart is going to be key to implementing a lot of this, and he's clearly a really busy guy with a lot of other stuff on his plate. So I think that's a piece, that's a big part of it.
Great, thanks, Kate. And I was really fascinated. Let me ask one more question, then we'll go to the Twitter questions, which I have in a growing line. The question that Pat's last comment spurred to me is, why not use this office as a place to have a series of exchanges? Perhaps DOD operators and concept developers come to this office, meet with interested people in the Valley, and say, here's 6 hard operational problems that we have a hard time with. Do you have any technologies relevant for this? So that creates a set of demand possibilities. You could also have people come from the Valley and say, I've thought about your problem for a little bit, and I think you're not preparing for a type of threat that I see coming, and here's what I would recommend. So sort of a supply approach. I mean, has there been any discussion yet of that kind of structured conversation between operators and technologists where they can really, I think, advance the ball if they have an agenda and they push through it? And Pat and others, Kate, Michael, Steve, if you have any thoughts on that, would really appreciate it before we turn to the Twitter questions.
Let me just jump in with one quick thing, which is that I think that the incentive structure here is critical, and it goes back to what Steve said about Route 128 versus Silicon Valley, and that I think some of those conversations are starting and more need to happen. But one of the reasons why older Route 128 companies might not design something and then give it to people to play with is that they're worried about all the other Route 128 companies, or Lockheed or Boeing or Northrop or somebody else, taking that, running with it, and then being the one that gets the big procurement contract. And so I think that you need to structure those conversations in a way that makes everybody feel comfortable from an intellectual property perspective.
If I could add, Barry?
Yes, Pat.
I agree with that, and that was my reference to non-disclosure statements. The government definitely has to be much more at ease in having private conversations where this is shared. The tying of the structuring of business approaches to these technologies is really key. But I think that my one concern about this office is, as Kate was referring to, is it's really a middleman that's being introduced here between these technologists that I'm referring to in the DOD and in the Silicon Valley. For example, and so my concern is volume. And the Rapid Innovation Fund, for example, as they report, has since 2011 to 2014 had 10,800 white papers submitted. 4%, less than 4% actually ended up in contracts. But where I think that office could offer the best value is to literally be knowledgeable of where the expertise is in the huge Department of Defense laboratories and all the operational organizations, and be a connector. They really, I think they would be best at connecting between, and not carrying or structuring these conversations, but literally making the introductions for the people in the Silicon Valley that say, hey, I've got this idea, where can I go? If they could make those introductions and leave it at that and let the discourse occur with the subject matter experts throughout the bureaucracy, that would be a huge value added, and probably close to handling the volume that they're going to receive.
Along those lines, I just wanted to chime in that one of the people I spoke to said, you know, exactly what Pat said. That's where this office's value would lie if done correctly. And vice versa, when a Pentagon official with a problem to solve goes out to the Valley, that this office provides him the 10 experts he has to talk to while on his 2-day trip out to California, versus talking to the wrong people. I think that that's a big place where you can go wrong. You make a trip out to the Valley for 2 days and you talk to a lot of people, but none of them are the right people for the problem that you have to solve. So the office, if it has the right expertise, can make those linkages so those conversations can happen.
Thanks, Kate. Let me now turn to the Twitter questions, and I just retweeted at my Twitter account, at Barry Pavel, the 2 questions that Philip Groney, a very long-time experienced hand on these issues, he tweeted, and I'll read them very quickly, and would like to hear in particular Steve Grunman, but others on these 2 questions. Number 1, he says new technology involves risk. How can risk be incentivized in DOD? How can failure become an accepted part of military culture? And I think this was a major point of Michael Horowitz's initial remarks. And then second, he says it seems like one of the big impediments is the wall between the requirements process on the one hand and the acquisition processes on the other. And he asks, should we reverse Goldwater-Nichols, the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act, which gave much more power to the joint institutions? Should we reverse it and bring the service chiefs back into the acquisition process in a more prominent way? So 2 questions: risk in the culture, and how and to what extent might we bring the services back into a process so that they can make sure that they procure the equipment needed.
Sure. I'll jump in on that if you'd like me to. I'll start anyway. The perhaps doctrinaire but a little simplistic answer to the question of how to incentivize risk is to pay more rewards. On the one hand, that sounds glib. On the other hand, I think there's going to have to be some solution. The answer to that question is some formulation of enhancing the reward associated with success above 7 and 8% project or job profit. It's just not possible to get people to take big risks if the return on that as a general matter is likely to be less than 10%, so to speak. And that is a problem that the Pentagon's going to have to deal with. And one of the ways, again, that I would recommend they deal with it is to invest capital rather than revenue, inject capital rather than revenue into these companies. I'll leave it at that. The second point is, and it's not so clear to me that it is directly related to our ability to engage commercial firms like those exemplified by this label Silicon Valley, but I would, regardless, I would generally endorse the sentiment that perhaps we need to rethink the exclusion of the service chiefs, the uniformed service chiefs, from acquisition management responsibility, as was done in the the Goldwater-Nichols bill. One of the other ways to incentivize action, maybe one of the most powerful ways, Pat could speak to this perhaps, of incentivizing action in the Pentagon is to generate inter-service competition. And one of the for all the good that jointness has done us, one of the bads it has done us is it has tended to mute inter-service competition, which, if you go back into the immediate post-war 50s and 60s era, was a really important engine of change and innovation in the Department of Defense, was that inter-service competition for missions and roles, and bringing the service chiefs back into the acquisition chain of command doesn't do that. There's not a sufficient step in that direction, but it brings the need for inter-service competition to mind. I can imagine, for example, if services had the opportunity to compete over a mission area, that one or another of them would decide they're going to go after these commercial technologies in a big way in order to give themselves an advantage over other services that either culturally or bureaucratically or for simple lack of energy and leadership had decided they would try to wring out of their own laboratories, or some such alternate paradigm as that.
If I could add also, I agree with Steve. I think a good example to look at is Special Operations Command. They have unique acquisition authorities, and I've been amazed by how quickly they can take a technology, develop it, and take it completely through in one organization, the entire life cycle. And that is directly motivated by the operational commander's needs. And so I think what we have today that we did not have in the era of Goldwater-Nichols, that Goldwater-Nichols was trying to fill, was the motivation for adopting another service's technology and working in a joint fashion that today is driven by cost savings. We're at the point with cost savings that I think that the need to divorce a lot of the acquisition decisions and the intermediate steps from the services is no longer needed. And I agree, that is I think would be a positive step in bringing the service chiefs back in. And to quickly address the question on risk, again, I would endorse more experimentation. I think one way to handle risk is to incrementally provide enough funding to show prototypes and then stop it there and then review it. But at least there would be more of an appetite to lower the cost of the developments and go for a much greater volume of experimentation. Thanks,
Pat. Let me go to the next question from Sean Lingas. I just retweeted it again at my account at Barry Pavel. I'll recite the question, but would in particular be interested in the general general option. I alluded to lots of skepticism in the Valley about DOD and its outreach, and can I give hard evidence? And I would simply ask Pat O'Reilly, Michael, any of our panelists, what's the root? Can you give us a thumbnail of why the skepticism in Silicon Valley, why they will need to be further enticed into this market in order for it to be successful?
I can tell you from firsthand experience that the skepticism is driven, again, by the drawn-out discourse that occurs between the companies trying to work. If we're interested in working with the DOD, the processes are monumentally longer, and the uncertainty in the outcome of your investment is much greater. By investment, I mean time and energy. Trying to engage the department, and to go through, for example, I gave here was a year-long process to find out whether or not some ideas, white papers, things that were disclosed would actually come to any type of fruition is really on the complete outside, in my view, of the targets, the business targets, the objectives and things that businessmen in the Silicon Valley and technologists are looking at. It's just plain very slow, very uncertain, and you don't really find out till the end. And there is this wall, not said derogatorily, of contracting officials that you really see if you're a company and not familiar with who's on the other side of that wall, that perhaps these initiatives can lower. But you're not speaking the same language with the same incentives that and the same intention that the people you are talking to on the other side, if you're from a Silicon Valley view.
Yeah, I think from a business practices perspective, what we sometimes see is what one would call a rewarding A while hoping for B, and Silicon Valley is noticed, and that's when you say you want one thing but reward another. And how long in Washington have we been having this? The defense acquisition process needs to be nimble. We need to be faster, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we've been having this discussion. I mean, heck, from even before 9/11, and I think that's indicative of process challenges that we've had in Washington that people in Silicon Valley have noticed. And while they want to work on really interesting problems, I think that the last comment's absolutely right, that the idea of competing in secret for a year and then finding out you're not even going to get to work on that problem because some much bigger defense company got the contract and it was kind of baked in from the beginning, can be discouraging. And so I think more signs of good faith are necessary.
I was just going to add two funny things I heard from folks was, the idea that eventually there'll be, and this was, an example of sort of the cynical attitude about it, but eventually there'll be an innovation badge that you can earn, or that there'll be an innovation requirement, as part of it. But I think that I think that the skepticism is that the bureaucracy will eat up all these good ideas and not let them move forward.
Steve.
Yeah, let me just add a couple thoughts on this. One is that there aren't that. If you look at the entire investment budget, the modernization budget of the DOD, there aren't that many dollars that the Silicon Valley is well positioned to address. We're not expecting. I don't think Ash Carter is expecting Silicon Valley to build tanker aircraft. I think he may be expecting them in a subsequent iteration of a tanker aircraft, maybe to bring some sort of an ISR overlay into it, something like that. But so one observation to make is that in the greater scheme of the today's DoD modernization budget, it's a small minority of dollars that are even conceivably addressable by these again, this label Silicon Valley is one point to be made. And excuse me, and when such an opportunity presents itself, and I can't help but cite the win of Amazon Web Services over Big Blue IBM for the cloud computing contract at the intelligence agencies, they do step in and compete. In this case, even win. But they do step in and win when there is an opportunity that they can address. But the other thing the other response to this skepticism that I would offer is to remember that the folks in Silicon Valley want to get rich, and on the one hand want to get rich, and a lot of the reflex about their skepticism toward the Pentagon's outreach to them arises from this premise that they want to get rich, and the Pentagon's not going to let them get rich in any number of ways. But I think on the other hand, the other thing to remember about Silicon Valley is a lot of them also want to change the world. And I think part of what, and again, think about these companies and the way they came into being, even the now behemoths like Google, right? A big part of their mission statement, and I think not cynically, was we want to change the world. And let's face it, some of them actually have. And so I think part of the other message of Carter's outreach was to say, I have big world scale and world class problems that I need your help with, and I think thereby was trying to refocus the ambition of or the opportunity of the Pentagon in the eyes of Silicon Valley to a marketplace where they can exercise that instinct and ambition to change the world. And then so I think the Pentagon can work that, because let's face it, there are some world-changing and world scale of consequence problems in national security, which I think concomitant to their desire to get rich, the titans of Silicon Valley will respond to.
Thanks, Steve. We have another question on Twitter as our time comes close to wrapping up. We have another 5 or 8 minutes or so. The Stern Group, Paula Stern, Atlanta Council Board Director, asks, how does this new office that we're discussing, how does it work with DARPA? What's DARPA's role in this to ensure we support a robust innovation pipeline? This is a long-established agency of the Defense Department that has had quite a few wins over decades, and I'm not sure if we've heard the word DARPA in this conversation yet. So how does it play into this? How can it play into this, and how does it work with this new office? Or is DARPA already well connected to Silicon Valley and doesn't need to do a whole lot different?
I think that goes what I was saying earlier about having a good lay of the land before you set off. Having a thorough assessment of where you stand and where is your talent now and what talent is working and what's working for you. So it's a great question. I don't actually know how where DARPA stands in the Valley and how its interaction with this office is going to be. But that's a key. That seems like a key point going forward. I know that part of Carter's announcement involved having a robotics, a final robotics competition, I think, hosted by DARPA. So he meant, DARPA was part of his speech if it's not part of our conversation today. So I think that is a key part of this.
Thanks, Kate.
I would agree. I think DARPA is plainly a part of the formula. Indeed, already today, right? One shouldn't overlook the success that DARPA has at engaging the commercial world. Although it's not uniform, depends on the project and the program manager. Again, some of the problems that DARPA is working on are not addressable, if you will, by the kinds of industry that we regard under this rubric in Silicon Valley, but others are, and I think they do so. The only thing I would point out is that DARPA's business model is still to buy engineering hours and buy prototypes. And that may not be a sufficient transactional form by which to really engage what incentivizes, again, this broad label we're calling Silicon Valley. Barry, you're either frozen or reticent.